Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today, 360-degree feedback coaching best practices. My name is Justin Warner, and I'm going to be the host of today's webinar. Today's webinar is approved for 1 hour of HRCI and SHRM credit. The completion or the code will be emailed to all the participants who have completed the viewing requirements. So instead of showing at the very end, we will actually email you that code. For those of you who will be watching on demand, please request the code by contacting me, Justin Warner, at DecisionWise, or emailing info@decision-wise.com. And that email address is found at the top of our website. So once you've completed the webinar, please just email us, and then we will send those codes to you once we've verified you've completed the viewing requirements. So for today's webinar, I'm joined by Dan Deka. Dan is a senior consultant and an executive coach here at DecisionWise. Dan graduated from Loyola Marymount University and received an MBA from San Diego State University. I see a theme there that Dan likes the beach area. So those are both very beautiful campuses. So that was probably rough. And then received his certificate or certified executive coach designation from Georgetown University. Dan joined DecisionWise after 20 years in the corporate world, where he focused on performance management, organizational design, change management, employee engagement, and executive development. So, Dan, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to chat about these topics.
All right. So, Dan, as we get started here, I know that you wanted to go through and talk about the purposes of today's webinar. So, why don't we spend a couple of minutes and talk about, the purpose of what we want to get out, what you hope to accomplish with today's webinar, and why this is important to our audience.
Sure. Well, the purpose for today is really to explore some best practices and some learnings that we've had and over my career and experiences about debriefing and coaching from 360s, because there's a real interest. There's always been an interest, but I think there's been a resurgence in it around the use of 360s as a development tool. And so you do the 360, but then how do you get the most out of it? And how do you use that feedback to help people grow and change? So we'll talk about that debriefing, and then we'll also talk about the coaching that can come around it, because I see a distinction between those. You debrief a 360, maybe after you do the 360, you have one meeting where you're debriefing the results, helping them create an action plan, but then there's ongoing coaching that can come from that. So we want to shed some light on that. So our desired outcomes are really that we enlarge and amplify your 360 debriefing and coaching toolkit. You already do this most likely, or you have an interest in it, so you have skills from other experiences that you've had. So we want to add and enlarge your toolkit. And some of the primary ways that we're going to do that is we're going to go through an overview of some of our principles, some principles that we found to be very helpful. So we'll talk about those. And then we'll also make sure that we'll go over our coaching model. You may or may not have a coaching model, so we'd like to share ours. And it's a lot. There's a lot in there in that model, but we find it to be helpful. It's a really good starting point. And then just some other learnings and best practices. So that's the main thing. And by the end of that, and the output is we want you to just feel more confident and capable about debriefing and coaching around 360s. So one of the things that we'll start with is just why to use 360s. And, a primary thought there is that you use a 360 to create a disruption in an individual's perception. We're all walking around on this planet, and we all think that we make perfect sense, and everything that we do actually lines up to what we think. But it's very helpful to get some feedback around this is how you're actually showing up. This is how other people are seeing you. So I consider to be the 360 a form of disruption because it disrupts that person's perception of how they think they're showing up. And so the reason that you would do this disruption is to increase their awareness of how they're thinking, how they're showing up, and to deepen and widen their perspective. A lot of my time coaching is around helping people become more aware of their thinking. As they become more aware of their thinking, Then they can become more aware of the emotions that they have around these topics, and then their choices, their actions, and their results. So for me, and that's a pretty foundational thought of, and we'll talk about this a little bit further, how do you help people change the most? And a lot of people say, hey, I want to change this behavior. I want to delegate more, communicate more. But we found it most effective to go to their thinking around delegation or communication, because that drives their feelings and their actions and their results. So that's one of the main reasons that I think we use 360s, is to give people an opportunity to disrupt their current thinking so they can have different choices.
Dan, before we slide off of this, so a lot of organizations use 360s. Some use it for professional development as a development tool. Some even use it for performance reviews. Can you just give your thoughts on best practice really quickly about pros and cons maybe of using it for one or the other or both?
Sure. Yeah, and that's a common question that you get, and that's a common question that you're usually trying to define within your organization. Is a 360 just for performance, or is it just for development, or is it a combination of both? I mean, from my experience, my preference is that it has a developmental focus, and that 360 is very personal. Hopefully got some other vehicles in your system, in your talent management system, like performance reviews or one-on-ones to address the performance issues. But a 360, I think, has a lot of power around the developmental area. It's a very personal process, and so it's an opportunity for people to get feedback. A 360 is a proxy for a bunch of different conversations. They get their feedback, they see where their perceptions differ from others, and then they can choose what they want to work on. And when you're talking about helping people develop, the more choice that you can give them around that, of how they use it, and it's for them, I think there's a greater possibility for them to take that disruption and use it as a stepping stone. When you start to bring in performance management and other people into this conversation, it moves a little bit away from that development, and it gets a little bit more challenging. But I know a lot of organizations do a lot of different things with them. My preference is it's more developmental.
Great.
So those are some thoughts around why 360s. And then we talk about debriefing and coaching. So I talked about it being a disruption, and if you have this disruption and you're trying to turn it into a stepping stone, into a learning experience, it's like, how do you go about doing that? And so that's where I think the debriefing and coaching comes in, is they have this disruptive experience of, gosh, the way I see the world isn't the way that everyone else sees it. And now how do I turn that disruption into a learning experience? And you do that through the debriefing process, where you've provided some support around them for that, and then also the coaching process, where they're going through that and they can explore those. So another thought that we have around that is around debriefing and coaching is, we don't just learn from our experience, but we learn from the debrief of experience. And just some examples of that. You could have some sporting examples of where you may learn something. You learn something from you're taught like how to swing a golf club in a different way, or how to putt, and you learn that, and you have that idea. But then there is a lot of value that comes from a debrief of that. So how does it feel to hold that club in that way? How does it feel? What are you thinking before? And that support around that from the debrief of the experience is where a lot of value comes. So it's the same thing with the 360. We can get a report, and some organizations will get the report, give it to the employee, and the employee's kind of on their own to do that. But boy, when we're able to debrief that experience, so how was the 360 process for you? Tell me about the people that the feedback that you received. How did you experience that? Was it new? Was it a surprise? What was a surprise to you? What did you already know but hadn't admitted to yourself? What did you learn from the 360 about your strengths? How did it strengthen and improve your perception of you as a leader? And then the idea of, now what are you going to focus on, and helping them through that process. So that's a big thought, just around, it's not just the experience of doing the 360 and getting it that helps you turn that into a learning experience. It's a debrief.
So Dan, a lot of the people that are on the call with us, HR people, managers, directors, CEOs, oftentimes they will receive the feedback, but sometimes they're also ones giving feedback and helping others feel encouraged to take this 360 and then receive that debriefing process, where that might be a little bit should I do this? Should I not do that? What advice would you give to somebody saying, yeah, we want to do the 360 and this debrief is extremely valuable? What little tidbits might you say in selling it to others within their organization?
I think a big part of it is the experience of it. One thing that we do and that I found helpful is when an organization's trying to decide and the HR team's trying to decide or executive team is around like, hey, is this 360 process something real? I go, hey, have you done one in the past? Why don't we get that and let's debrief that? Yeah. And I can give them that experience of what a debrief looks like so they can see the difference between what it's like sitting in a room by yourself looking at your results or sitting with a partner, someone that has that experience to help you see it in a different way. So I think that's really helpful. And then in a larger kind of organizational change standpoint, I know in a lot of organizations, to get the buy-in for the 360, we usually start with a small group. I mean, it's nice if you can start at the top. You don't always need to, but you build some momentum around that. And then organizationally, people see like, wow, these people went through this 360. I've seen a difference. That's probably the most powerful kind of lever that you have for change.
Great.
So those are just some thoughts around the debriefing and coaching, just like why is it important? And yeah, you can get a copy of the slides. We'll give those to you after. This is something probably for you just to write down for yourself of just what is the most challenging thing around the 360 debriefs? What questions do you have around that? And I'd encourage you to spend a little time in that just to see what your thinking is around the 360s. And so spend a little time on that, jot some of those down. And then another thing to think about for the 360s is what's the most fun? What is the most fun thing that that you get out of doing a 360? Where's the opportunity in that? So I think that's such something good for you to think about. And what's challenging? What's the most fun? And then we're going to go through some debrief principles. We're going to go through some models. And then after, come back and say, hey, how did these debrief principles address my challenges? And how am I leveraging some of these things when I'm having fun with it? Am I tapping into some of these principles?
Yeah. So Dan, you do a lot of 360 debriefs, and in fact, you and I have done those together. So, for you, what's one of the most fun things that you experience when you do a debrief with an individual?
I think for me, it's just an absolute privilege to be with anyone when they're trying to make a change. And so I consider that to be a super sacred opportunity, and to be there when someone is vulnerable, for the idea that someone is expressing that trust with me and saying, hey, Dan, here are my results, and I'd like to partner with you on that. And so that's a huge part. And a lot of people get into human resources because they love helping people. And these 360 experiences can be a great source of that. So I consider it to be a sacred time. And we're going to talk a little bit about some ways that we approach it. Something that makes it even more impactful for employees, and the things that I enjoy most is when we do a 360, we don't make the center of the conversation their results. We actually make the center of their conversation what they want to achieve in the next 6 to 12 months. And if I was going to ask you or give you one piece of advice to actually make the debrief process more enjoyable for you as the person that's debriefing or coaching, it would be that. If you look at it and you're like, I'm actually just going to be interpreting these results, that's pretty static, it's pretty finite, it's on the piece of paper. But if you go into it and you're like, I want to learn what the most important thing is for this person, what they want to accomplish over the next 6 to 12 months, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to put that at the center of the conversation, and then we're going to use the 360 to see how that sheds light and inspires what they want to achieve. That changes the interaction a lot too. So, great. So what I wanted to start to do now is go through some principles. So I've got 3 of them that I'm sure that you'll be familiar with and that you leverage in some way, but I just wanted to share how we kind of look and think about that. So I've already talked around the 360 being disruptive, but it's disruptive to what? It's to our perceptions, to our thinking about ourselves and how we show up. And to turn that disruption into a learning experience, a stepping stone, if you will, I've already talked about this a little bit. You, as the person debrief, create this safe place for someone to explore and to support them as they realize some additional perspective. And that gets back to that fun part too, to be able to do that for someone. They have something that they're potentially nervous about, may have some anxiety about what do other people think about me with the 360, and you're able to be with them, create that safe place and explore this to help them is a fantastic opportunity. And it's disruptive, and you're helping them realize perspective around what? There are some common things that show up. Everyone, all of us has this lowest score of fixation. So if I give you a report that's got 10 things on it, I mean, your eye initially is going to go to which one's the lowest. We all do that, and it's a very powerful thought for us. We've been trained, we've gotten to this place in our career, we have relationships, and the reason is we've grown up and developed this ability to go, is there a problem? How do I fix it? And that's super successful, but it can be overused, and we can become fixated on the low score and not see the value of our high scores and the value of what people are saying around the themes of what we have. So that's one way that you really help, is you help combat that low score fixation when you're doing a debrief. And then another one is people downplay and ignore their strengths. We all do that. If I asked you right now, hey, could you share some of your strengths with us? You'd probably be pretty modest and pretty humble, which is a beautiful thing. But sometimes we need to appreciate what our value is, and a 360 can help with that. A lot of times people are worried that it's just going to point out the things that they've done wrong, or the things that they think that only they know and no one else knows, and they're worried about that. But I'd say half the time I'm ending up spending time focusing on the strengths that people haven't really paid attention to. So that's very uplifting. And then this is interesting. I just said the strengths that they ignore. But another thing that happens within a 360 is the identification of overused strengths. And depending on where you're debriefing someone, if they're an individual contributor and this is the first kind of 360 they've ever done, or if they're a manager or a director or a VP or an executive, they probably are pretty clear on their strengths, at that point, and they're probably pretty clear of their derailers and opportunities. But what I find super helpful is to help them identify some places where they have some overused strengths. And just an example of that is, as an individual contributor, they may have been really good at planning in an organization. But as they've moved through the organization and their roles, they may still be holding on to that planning and organizational skill that they had as an individual contributor. But as a director or as a VP, they need to lighten up on that. They need to loosen their grip on that strength and give space for other people. Sometimes that'll show up if they're really strong and they overuse planning and organization, but they may not be open to the team. They may get feedback on one of their derailers as they're perceived as not being a team player or not open and engaged because they have this focus on planning. And there's a lot of shifts as people move from an individual contributor up to a leader and a senior leader. But one of the ways that's super helpful for them is to help them identify possibly some of these overused strengths. And that's a nice place to coach from when you say, hey, by the way, you have this great strength and you're really good at this. But you may not have to focus as much on it now as you have in the past. So you can lighten up on that a little bit and maybe put some energy and focus into some other areas of development. And that's a lot easier to receive than if I said to someone, you have this gap you need to fill. That's what they're expecting. And when I say, hey, you have a strength that you might be overusing, you just need to dial that back a little bit. In fact, you're so competent at it, you don't even need to worry about it anymore. Focus in another area. So those are that's a debrief principles. It's a 360 is disruptive, and it's to our thinking, and how can you help them with that? So I find that to be super helpful. And then another one is, where's the answer? Where is the answer that you're looking for? You're doing a debrief, and you're doing it because someone wants to improve. They want to change. They want to become a more effective leader. And so, I'd ask you to answer that question in your head or on a piece of paper right now. Where's the answer? Where is it? And as a coach, it's in a different place. When I get hired as a consultant, they're asking me to give them an answer, and the answer is it's in me. It's from things that I've learned. Like I was just on a call today and we were talking about organizational design, and they're designing an organization, and I asked them, hey, do you have any models, organization design models? They're like, no. I said, well, I like the J. Galbraith STAR model or the McKinsey 7S, and I'm giving them an answer, and we work through that. So when you hire me as a consultant, it's within me. But when you're a coach, the answer is in the participant, and it's not in the report, and it's not in you. As a coach, you are helping them to find that answer, and it's within them. There's a lot that we could talk about this, but as far as debriefing, that mindset of where's the answer dictates a lot of how you interact with them. Because if you believe that the answer's in the report, you're probably going to lean pretty heavily in that report. If you believe it's on yourself, you're probably going to spend a lot of time talking. If you believe that answer is in someone else and you want to help them find that, you're probably going to be asking a lot more questions, and you're going to help them explore and find that answer themselves. And we all know we are more engaged if we are involved in that process, if we are connected to it, and if we're able to find that answer, we're more committed to it. So that's a big one for me, is when you're debriefing 360s, where's the answer? And if you think it's in the report, you may not be that pumped about it. But boy, if you think the answer's in the person, and now you have this report, you have them, your interaction can be much more engaging.
Yeah, Dan, it's interesting that you say that, because we often hear people say that they've had a negative experience with a 360, and it feels like that negative experience comes from the focus being on the report. Yeah. And when we just put all that focus on the report, whether they get a debrief or no debrief, and they're just there to look at it, it can be a negative experience, and people walk away not feeling like that was a way for them to improve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes people will be like, you must do a lot of debriefs, and I go, I do, and they're like, do you get tired of that? Do you get bored of that? And do you start seeing the patterns? But I mean, just to give you a little bit of glimpse of how my mentality around it, I've already told you where's the center of the conversation. It's in, and we're going to chat more about that. It's in what they want to achieve. That's exciting. And I also kick it off. I get to know people. We can do it pretty quickly. I go over my history, and then I go over their history, and I'm listening for these mental models that they have, for these developmental experiences, for these strong thoughts that they've had about their lives, and then I'm trying to make the connection between those patterns they have and their 360 results. I mean, that is whether you like puzzles, if you think about that of this is a puzzle to solve with the answer in someone else, or it's just the opportunity to spend time with an amazing human being, it makes it a lot of fun. I also, the bar for 360s is very low. For people's participation, oftentimes we'll do a debrief and they're like, wait a minute, I thought that all we were going to do was go over the results and you were going to tell me how awful I was. It's like, no. We're going to help you achieve what you want to achieve. We're going to focus on strengths, and it's going to be motivated by you. So I find that to be super helpful. So with that, so those are some principles that we have. The next thoughts are around a little bit more, I already asked you of well, where's the answer? But then the next thing is what's your role as a coach? And we've talked about that. We've said a 360 is disruptive. And so your role is to create this safe environment where you stay out of the box, you help them define and verbalize their answer, and you provide direction so they can come to some new actions. You're increasing their awareness. A statement in there of staying out of the box is, your role as a coach. And I'll give you our model to kind of how do you help stay out of this box. The idea with a 360 debrief or a coaching conversation is there's you, there's the participant that you're talking with, and then there's what you're talking about. And there's almost, you could connect those lines, it's like a triangle. And what you want to stay as a coach and in the debrief is you want to stay connected to the client, to the person, and you don't want to jump into the box of the conversation. You can get distracted by that, you get pulled into that. And then, an example of that is, if they talk about something and they talk about a conversation that they've had with their manager about being very, not providing them enough freedom to do what they want to do and enough autonomy, I could jump in the box and say, oh yeah, that reminds me of the last manager that I worked with and that I worked for and the problems that I had. that's jumping in the box with them. And when I do that, I lose my awareness. I actually get pulled back into my past experiences or my future fears, and I'm not there for the client. And so that's what I mean by staying out of the box. And boy, that's a skill that's a wonderful skill. It takes a lot of practice, but I find that people find that helpful when they're debriefing. It's just like you're focused on what the person's talking about, and it'll come up. Somebody will mention that, the thought will come up, but then you need to let that thing go away and stay focused on where they're at.
It's interesting because that's a sign of trying to show empathy, right?
Yeah.
That you're trying to show empathy and get into the box with that. But what you're saying is that might be counterproductive then.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and it actually takes us to our coaching model, and there's a lot of information here, but you'll see that at the top we go, well, to debrief one of these things and to coach someone, you need to listen, observe, validate, and empower. And if you think about those terms, and we'll go through each one of these, if you listen, you observe, you can validate without jumping in the box. Like I can, where that shows up is Justin, I can see why that would be a really challenging situation for you, but you don't need to jump in the box and go, and it was challenging for me, and this is why. And and actually this coaching model is designed to help you kind of stay out of the box and help others. And there's a lot of information. I'll walk through this so you have this, but this is definitely worthy of more discussion and exploration. But the first step is whenever you're coaching is to listen, and you're focusing on what's said. And your mindset is all around curiosity. I'm curious about it. And what it looks like is you're listening to understand, and that curiosity. What it sounds like is, tell me more of what's happening there, or that sounds really interesting. I'd like a little bit more. And so that's what listening, and we all know there's a bunch of different types of listening. There's listening for the words, there's listening empathetically for the emotion, there's listening for the things that aren't being said. So there's a lot around listening. But as a coach, you start with that. And then you move into this observing. So you're listening to what is said, but actually in observing, it's what is heard and seen. And your mindset is just the facts. Just let me focus on the facts of what's being said. And what it looks like is you share what you observe. And it's a very judgment-less summary. So it might sound like when you're observing, so when you're listening, you're saying, tell me more. When you're observing, you're like, here's what I heard you say. And it sounds like you want this to have happen, or it sounds like this is a challenge. And so you're repeating back to them so they know what you've heard, and you're making sure that your observations are in alignment with what they're experiencing and what they're describing to you. Then the next phase is around validating. And Justin, this is around the piece, and it's a very interesting piece where I can validate you, but I don't jump in the box. And here, when you're validating, you're focusing on what's felt. And the mindset is, how do I validate you? And what it looks like is you're sharing the emotion, and there's some acknowledgement. And what that sounds like is, I can see why you might say that. That comes from a lot of work by a really interesting guy, Fernando Flores, where there's a lot of training around the words and the action items and these action cycles. But that's a really powerful thing to be able to say as a coach, is I can see why you might say that. And that doesn't mean that I totally agree with you or I had that experience. It just means that I can see why you would make that observation. I can see why it would be very challenging for you to work in that situation. It makes sense that you would feel that given what you've shared. And that is a super important point, because you want to empower someone, you want to share some thoughts, but you have to be in a place where we talk about creating that safe environment. When people know you listen to them, and you didn't just listen to the words, you actually observed the whole content and context of what was around them, and you even validated the emotions that they were feeling. Boy, once you do that, that is a safe place, and then you can talk about what's possible. You can forward that thinking. You can explore options. This is all about faith and optimism. And you can ask that question, so what's next? Or what could improve this situation? Or what's your vision? What's the desired state of this relationship with your manager that's currently challenging? Boy, that's when you get into that. And you really have to, there's a bunch of different coaching models. This is just a simple kind of summary. Well, it's a model. It's a summary of a lot of things. But these processes that you go through, this is super handy with the 360. while you're listening to them. Yeah, have you ever done a 360 before? Yes or no? And then you're kind of observing, like, and what was your experience with the 360? Was it positive? You can sense those type of thing. And if they have any concerns, a lot of times people come up and you're like, look, I've done a 360 or I've provided feedback and it didn't remain confidential, or people figured out what I said. There's always a big fear of that. And so that's why, we have all of our processes in place, but you can validate that. I can see why you have some concerns about a 360. Now, how do you feel about this? And have we addressed that? Okay, now let's move forward. But it's a really powerful thought. A lot of times we have these thoughts and conclusions that we want to give people, these gifts. But boy, if they haven't felt listened to and they haven't felt observed or validated, they really don't care. And there's another saying, like, people don't care. What's the saying around what you think until they know that you care about them? And really powerful thought there. So so our principles around it's disruptive, where's the answer? And then you need to have a coaching model. You need to understand what your role is. And when I say your role is to create a safe environment, how do you do that? By listening, observing, validating, and empowering. Those are big steps. So the next one, the next couple principles that we have start with, I've talked a little bit around what do you put at the center of the 360 debrief conversation or any coaching conversation. And this is just a little bit more thought, around what we've talked about. You reposition the center from everyone else's perspective to their own. When they get a 360, sometimes people can even feel disempowered by a 360 because it's like, well, I have my feedback, but I asked 15 other people, and isn't it weighted towards them? And do I just need to do what these other people say? And I encourage them. I'm like, no, the purpose is for you to improve on what you want to improve on. So let's put that at the center, and then let's use this feedback as a gift. We often talk about feedback as a gift to help you achieve what you want to achieve. And so repositioning that center is very refreshing for people. They're surprised. And a lot of times people say, well, you mean we can do that? And I was like, oh, yeah, we can do that. In fact, we believe that that's the way it should be done. And so I talked a little bit around kind of the flow and the cadence of a 360 debrief. But like, how do you actually do that and reposition? It's through this question by tying to their purpose. So I'll usually, I start on a debrief. We usually send it to them 24 hours in advance. So they have it, so they can process it a little bit. They can go through that initial wave of emotion and thoughts and make some notes. But I don't want people dwelling on it by themselves in a room by themselves, because if they do, they're going to focus on those low scores, and they can get tied around it. So we give it to them 24 hours in advance, and then we set up with that support system that comes in. I meet with them. We do some introductions. I make sure they understand my background and where I've come from and kind of where I'm moving from. And then I have them go through their history so I understand them. And then the next question is what do you want to accomplish in the next 6 to 12 months? Like, I'll take them through that path of, here's, where did you grow up? And what was your high school experience like? And tell me about your first job and the decisions. And you let people go through that. And then you ask them, well, what's next? What's next for you? What do you want to accomplish? And sometimes you may get, I want to be promoted. I want to be in a different role. There are some goals that I want to achieve, and you get those, and you're able to position those at the center, and that's a really interesting experience. And as far as making a 360 debrief more exciting and more engaging, you have that, and you understand the center of what's most important to them, and then you go, great. Do you have any early hypotheses around what the 360 says that would help you? And they're usually able to make those connections, and then we start going through it. So just making that the center of it. And boy, that's the center. I've had a client just a couple weeks ago that was like, forget about the debrief, Dan. What's the center of of every conversation that I have? When I'm talking to my son, what's the center of that conversation? When I'm talking to my boss, when I'm talking to my directs. And he's like, it changes, And so it's a very powerful concept. So making that the center of the conversation is a really strong point and one of our debrief principles. And then I've talked a little bit about this. You probably, I'd ask you to think about this one just yourself. It's like, what theories and mental models do you have around the best way to help people change? Just kind of jot those down or think about those for yourself. For us, and for me, it's if I can increase someone's awareness, they have more choices. And what I find is people come to me and they say, Dan, I want to get these results. And I go, okay. And they want to focus on results. But what I found is if we start with their thinking, your thinking drives the emotions that you have, and those emotions drive which choices you have and what actions you take, and that drives the results. And so, like a lot of times, as an example of this, so let me give you a few more thoughts here, and then give you an example. I mean, this comes from a bunch of different places, and there's a bunch of different people that talk about this, but I believe really strongly that you can change behaviors faster by focusing on principles or your thinking than actually on behaviors or actions. And boy, that one took me a long time to actually work through. But as an example of this, like a lot of times delegation comes up, and people say, Dan, I want to delegate more. And we could say, okay, well, let's talk about some delegation skills and some actions that you could take. You could list out all your things, and then you could divide them up by your number of direct reports and focusing on those actions. But if we move back and I talk with them around, well, so tell me when you talk about delegation, what comes up for you, and what's your thinking around it? And what you'll normally find for people that aren't delegating very much, there's some thinking that's creating some feelings about delegation, the act of it, that move us into some actions. So as an example of that, I'll find a lot of people that will be thinking around delegation. Maybe they don't trust others to do it as well as they do. Now that's a powerful thought, because if we can work through that, or maybe they don't trust the people that they want to delegate to. There are these thinkings, and boy, if you had those thoughts, then you would have really different emotions around delegation. You may feel insecure about it. You may feel nervous about it. If you feel nervous, you're not going to take some actions to delegate. But if we can work on, okay, what are your thoughts around delegations? Well, I don't trust these people. Okay, well, is that legitimate? Or is that they just don't do it as well as you do? And we can work from there. You help people change their thinking, and their feelings and actions move from that. So that's why I'm always listening for mental models or paradigms when we're going through their personal history and where they show up in the report. And it just makes every 360 more of a thrilling adventure. So those are some thoughts around best way to help people change. And whatever thoughts you have around that, it's really important with how you would approach your debrief. So I got some powerful thoughts that I found to be powerful around working with your clients, and we'll go through that, and then we'll go through kind of a flow of the 360 and the debrief process, and then we'll see if we've got any time left for questions that we could answer. So some powerful thinking. These are some things that is just great to keep in your toolbox and have ready. I am always ready to encourage my clients to be gentle with themselves. We're not perfect, and then actually neither are your feedback providers. And you don't need to eat the whole thing at once is something that I'll talk with them about. They get this report, and it's like a burrito of feedback, and they feel like, I got to eat the whole thing. And you can see people holding it out in front of them, and then they just want to eat the whole thing. And if you eat the whole thing at once, you're probably not going to feel very good about it. But I encourage them, you can look at it, you can read it, you can put it down, and then you can choose which part of it you want to focus on. In fact, you're probably going to be more successful in turning this feedback into action and change if you pick one or two things rather than the whole thing. So just telling them to be gentle with themselves. You don't need to change everything right now. What do you want to focus on? And I've heard an analogy too around treating feedback like trick-or-treaters. You could have someone knocks on the door, and it's a little trick-or-treater, and maybe it's a little witch or a little officer or something, and you don't say, okay, come on in, whatever you want to do in the house, it's yours. You don't let them take over the place. You actually go, oh, that's such a cute costume. In fact, you give them a gift, and then you send them on their way. And with this 360 feedback, you can be like that and use that feedback. It's like a little trick-or-treater. It's like, here's some feedback you received. Oh, thank you for that feedback. Thank you, participants, for sharing that. I'm going to give you this gift of thanks, and then I'm going to choose what I do with it. But I don't need to let you in, run my whole house, run my whole life. from this 360. So I find that, and I just encourage people to be gentle with themselves. They just feel like they got to fix everything. And then a great practice or mantra to consider and to repeat when someone is actually going through any type of feedback, and this comes from a lot of work from Fernando Flores, is I can see why people might say this about me. It's not fact or fiction, but it's perception, and I'll seek to understand how I can use this to be a better leader. Boy, that is a great tool for someone to have in their toolkit when it comes to the 360, and a great home base to go to. Because if you don't go there in this place, you're going to go to a place of they're after me or I'm not good enough. And this is a much healthier place to view it from. And this is actually what you say when you're actually sending the trick-or-treater kind of on their way. So I find that to be helpful for people. And then another thing is just to make people aware of the who said that temptation and trap. It's so strong. It is totally normal, but it's not helpful. And for you as a coach or person there debriefing, this is a great example of something that you could listen to, you could observe. You could be like, wow, it sounds like there's a lot of contention around you, and I could see how you would be concerned around who said this to me. And if you can acknowledge that, that would be a hard place to be, but then you need to help them move on, and then you can empower them. But that's just something that I end up spending some time is. So just acknowledge it. It's totally normal, but it's not going to help you move through this. In fact, it could be a real detriment to your follow-up. So pick what's most important that you want to achieve your purpose and make that the center, not the who said this trap. So those are some thinking, those are some tools that you can share with your clients. And then the final thought that we have, and then we can take some questions and see what else you've got, is just how to review and respond to your feedback. This is really helpful to share with your participants. And we've talked about a few of these things. But like step one is helping them to create that center for analysis and review. So this is the process where you could ask them, take 5 minutes and write down, what do you want to accomplish over the next 6 to 12 months? Make that the center of your effort and how you utilize your feedback. So oftentimes, if we're doing some prep for debriefs and we have a group and we're doing maybe a webinar, or we have a group or a team and say, hey, the 360s are coming. Here's how you provide, select your feedback providers. This is something I'd actually have them do. I say, hey, let's get really clear on this before you get your feedback. So that's an option. So I do that. And then another thing that I do, like with that group, is I have them create their support network prior to getting that feedback. Like, who's going to help you maintain perspective and this forward momentum? And sometimes they'll say, I've got my HR person, or I have a coach. But I'm like, who else is around you? And who else could you engage in this support network? And so if I have a group before, I'll take 5 minutes and I'll have them write down that purpose. And I'll also take 5 minutes and I'll say, who could help you and engage as a part of your support network? And what would it take to get them involved? And I find those, just think about that. If you went into the 360 with that preparation and support, how different you would feel than sitting there just waiting to get your report and feeling nervous that you have to do it by yourself. So those are some big ones. And then when they actually get it, we just encourage them to take a first high-level review. What does it say? Read through the report once, notice what you feel, then put it down. Write down your early hypothesis of what you might think you want to work on, and then let it go. Let it sit down as a trick-or-treater, kind of let it go on its way, and let some things kind of develop from there. And then we tell them to go back, do a second pass, go a little deeper, make some notes. If you have an action plan, make some notes on your strengths, your lower scores, your gaps, and then the questions you have around themes and trends. So do that, and then meet with your support network and create your plan for action. And then finally, thank your feedback providers and share your plan. This is something that's really helpful for them to get set at the beginning is, hey, what are you going to do with this feedback? Well, I'm going to make a plan. Okay, and what are you going to share? We find it to be very, very powerful when people get their feedback, they work through it with a coach, with an individual, with their support network. They create an action plan of 1 or 2 things that they're going to focus on, and then they thank their feedback providers, those people that they invited, and say, thanks so much for providing the feedback. I've worked on a few things, and I decided I'm going to work on these 1 or 2 things, and those can be very high level, and ask them for help and feedback, and it just creates such a different feel for it. So those are some of the big ones. And
That's great. So Dan, we've actually done a really good job. This is fantastic, and we've done a good job of answering questions as they've come in. There have been a couple of ones that have just come in recently. One that a little bit earlier. Let me just address this one, and if you have any comments around this
Sure.
that came in earlier, and we wanted to wait for this, but 360s can be done at the individual level, at the team level. So the question was around, what about small departments, 2 or 3 people? When you do a 360, you really pull in people from not just your direct reports, but you're pulling in other people, you're pulling in peers, you're pulling in, you want to try to create a full 360 view of that so that it isn't a negative experience. Mm-hmm. And then for confidentiality reasons, you do put limits on when you'll report out and what you want to protect confidentiality. But really a 360 could be done for an individual contributor who doesn't have any direct reports, or for a manager who might have only 2 or 3 direct reports, and it still can be effective when it's done in the right way, communicated the right way, mm-hmm. with a good solid debrief at the end.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with like the culture of feedback in an organization. If people aren't used to giving feedback, then you probably want to be sensitive to that. And one thing that I find is, if you're going to have some people that are going to do 360s, it's really helpful if that manager has had that experience before. So the manager knows this is what it feels like. This is what energy it takes to create an action plan, and that manager is there and ready to help them move through that. So that's just one thought of like, what's the pace and how are you gonna kind of introduce it. If a manager doesn't know what that experience is like, it can be really difficult for an employee to move through it. So that's kind of a quick thought around that.
Great. So we do have a couple other questions coming in as well. And yes, we will be sharing these PowerPoints. Sometimes we can't share the slides because we have information that we just aren't ready to get out there. The information here we're absolutely willing to share with you. And even more with this is DecisionWise offers a coaching training. And Dan, maybe you can spend a little bit of time about the purpose of this training and why we offer this. And we have one that's upcoming in September 18th and the 19th at the DecisionWise headquarters in Utah. This has been a great experience for those who have participated in it. And we want to invite you to attend the coaching training. And for those of you who are on the webinar, and I jumped to this really fast because I know once we start answering questions, some people jump off, and I want to make sure that they're aware of this. But normally, what we have with our coaching training is normally it's about $1,000 for 2 days of training. And as a gift to you for attending the webinar today, we just want to make sure that if you're interested in coming, that we're going to knock that in half, $500 a person if you want to attend the webinar. Don't register on the website, even though the website's there, can give you a little bit more information. Contact me directly, and I will put you through and get you that discount. But for any of you who would be interested in learning more about how to debrief a 360, the coaching model that Dan described, and we go into it in far greater detail, this is a great opportunity to expand your horizon. And for those who have larger groups, this is something we come on site and train where there might be larger groups. But if there are 1 or 2 of you that would like to come and be trained, again, love to have you take advantage of this. And so, Dan, any comments around the training, and then we'll finish answering some of the questions that are coming in.
Yeah, we shared. I've been doing this for quite a while, and I kind of condensed 20 years of thoughts and experiences into 45 minutes, and so there's a lot in there. But in the training, we go over where's the background of the 360s, how are they designed, and understanding the design of it to create an experience, and then that debriefing model. We do coaching practice where we actually have reports and feedback that people have gone through, and they're coaching each other. They're practicing the listening, observing, the validating, the empowering, and then we're talking about more specific things and patterns that we see in 360 and how to approach those. So super fun.
Great. And so following the webinar, we'll actually send out an email to everyone who attended, and it will have the copy of the slides or a link to where you could download the slides, as well as the HRCI and SHRM credit codes will be available to you. They'll both be in that email. So we're getting a lot of people asking for the slides again. Absolutely, we'll make sure that those slides are in there. This presentation is on demand as well. So after we're done here, it will be immediately on demand. If you want to go back and watch, if you missed parts of it, not a problem. So Dan, I know there was a specific question you wanted to answer. Let's maybe backtrack a little bit and answer that question.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the one of them is, and I'm just going to read this and then just talk through it. And we've got a couple minutes to walk through these. Good. Yeah. And then if you have any other questions right now, feel free to type them in there and we can address them. Says, I find it very difficult for people that are seasoned in their career to get buy-in for feedback like this. Most of them want to know their numbers and where they rank. And what can I do to get them to see the forest here instead of focusing on the trees? One of the things, it's a great question, and especially I appreciate the highlight of people that have been successful. You know, they may be very focused on data and numbers, and I end up talking to a lot of people. One thing I emphasize, like you're saying here around the forest, is a 360 is a collection. It's a proxy for a bunch of conversations, but it is not an income statement. It is not something that you're looking at that I find a lot of value to look at the decimal points in it, but it's a thematic theme, a thematic item where you are identifying the summary from all these conversations and the themes as they apply to what you want to focus on. So, one thing that I end up doing is I end up highlighting that to them and we talk about that in the beginning. And I'll give them an example. Like on our 360s, we have a 7-point scale. My eye doesn't even go to anything for things that are within a point of each other. Whereas an individual looks at it and go, oh, I got rated as excellent. I rated myself as excellent, but somebody else rated me as very good on this. We're a point off. And I'll say to them, no, that's within a point, you are aligned. But let's look for the things where you have a 1.5 or 2 points. Now, those are the places. So that's like a practical example of trying to get them off, those numbers and more into the themes. So, and then another way to do that is to make the center of the conversation what they want to achieve. That shifts people a lot because the data is the trees. But boy, when you ask someone, what do you want to accomplish? The most important thing for you in the next 6 months, 12 months, and they'll ask me, oh, Dan, do you mean personally or professionally? And I go, yes, that'd be great, both of those. And boy, when you do that, you bring them into the forest. You actually bring them into the planet and looking at the whole big picture.
That's great. So, Dan, another question is sometimes people ask, should they do a 360 without coaching? That it might not be practical to have coaching when they do a 360. Can you maybe give your observations with that?
Yeah, and I can totally understand that if you're, your budget, if you're like, look, we really think that this will be a helpful resource for people and we want to give them this feedback, but we don't have, the resources for that. I would say, and this goes back to some of these principles, we don't just learn from experience, we learn from the debrief of experience. I believe the debrief of a 360 is more valuable and can be more valuable than the 360 report itself. So I'd encourage you to try to find, if you can't get a coach to do that, or if you can't get someone from HR that has that coaching experience, then that's where I go to, hey, how do you develop that network? So the network of people, like, who are you going to share this with? But I just, if you think a 360 is a disruption, the way you're going to get the most value out of that is by creating a support network around it. So I think it's really critical whether, ideally with my background and my business, in the business that we're in, like we feel very strongly about coaching and having a professional and certified coach doing that, someone with that experience and perspective, but if not, just someone else.
Yeah. So another question is, how do you transfer, so you do the debrief, they work on an action plan, they do something like that. Do you usually continue that follow-up? Is it a manager that does the follow-up? What's the handoff for accountability in going forward?
That's an interesting thought around, and especially just around coaching and the type of support that you provide. Like I'll often tell people, like, look, I'm in this coaching relationship and I'll go where you want to go, but I'm actually not going to work harder than you are at this. And it sounds like a weird thing to say, and an example of that, from the debrief is you want to empower them with the one or two things that they want to focus on. You want to empower them because it's about what's most important to them. And you want them to have that list of here are the one or two things. And then you want to, at the end of that debrief, to get to a place where you're like, okay, next steps. One of the next steps is meeting with your manager or your support network. When are you going to do that? So you try to, if you're just doing it in one debrief, you're trying to get them to own it, and the whole process is to get them to own it. The center of the conversations around what they want to achieve, the curiosity, the premise that the answer was within them, all of that creates this sense of ownership for them. But then you're facilitating that process. And then, you can there's a bunch of different options. You could say, hey, let's get back together in a month for half an hour and chat through what you've noticed and what you've found. There definitely is there's a long tail to the learning that can come from a 360. It's not just this one event. And if you get back with them in 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, or if you have an ongoing coaching relationship, you often refer back to this 360 because when they first get to 360, they see it in one way. But then as they learn and they have more awareness about things and more perspective, they're able to see other things. So that's another thing is 360 isn't just this one and done type of thing. It's a tool that can continue to provide value.
That's great. Thanks, Dan. Well, I know we're wrapping it up right now, so maybe we just follow up and hit the points on how we did and make sure we close this up good and appreciate everyone for attending there. So.
You bet. So just the main things we're here, I just ask you to feel better equipped to debrief, any 360s that you may have. And then have we added and amplified your toolkit? Do you better understand, the principles behind it and the coaching model? And do you feel more confident and capable to debrief 360s? And we hope that you are. And it's all about your confidence and your capability. And Justin talked about this, the training opportunity that we have. And we'd invite you to participate in this. If you have any further questions, you can contact Justin or myself. If there's anything that came up in this, and I'd encourage you, I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free. Let's connect on LinkedIn. And if you have any questions that you just want to pass by both of those, through LinkedIn, feel free. And there's my email. So I'd love to connect with you and love to, if there's anything in here that you had a specific question about that you didn't get the opportunity to ask and get answered, just reach out to me. That's so great. It's been a pleasure to spend time with everyone. I wish I could meet all of you individually and chat more, but feel free to reach out.
Great. Dan, thank you so much for your time today.
You're
This
welcome.
has been fantastic. Thank you all for attending. And again, this will be on demand if you want to go back and watch it or share it with others. Please feel free to do that. Again, watch for the email that will have the codes for the credit for those who are requiring that credit. Thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.